What's up guys, Agent here again with another theory crafting video, and today we're going to kind of be discussing the two main tanking classes in the game right now and kind of how they compare to each other, my thoughts and opinions on which one I think is better, as well as kind of how, or at the very least how endgame PvE players tend to look at these two major classes. So if you guys can already tell on the screen, we'll be talking about Dragonknight tanks versus the Warden tanks. So compared to the other three classes, so Templars, Sorks, and Nightblades, these two tend to dominate when it comes to support roles, both, or I should say, they dominate in the tanking role. And so Wardens were added in Morrowind about, must have been a little over a year ago now, and since then they've kind of mainly been playing support mostly, so either tanks or healers, but when they were first introduced, there was kind of a question of whether or not they'd be able to replace or kind of usurp the Dragonknight spot as the meta tank in endgame PvE trials. So far it doesn't seem like that's happening. However, the Warden tank definitely brings something to the table that the Dragonknight tank doesn't. So we're going to be discussing kind of my opinions on kind of how they play, as well as the advantages and disadvantages that they both have if you decide to go to Dragonknight or a Warden tank. Now we will be discussing primarily class-based abilities, just because all the other skill trees are pretty much available to everybody in the game, no matter what class you are. So, you know, the one-handed skill tree, the destruction staff tree, your undaunted tree, those are all available to everybody. So we're going to be really focusing in on the class, what the class itself brings, or class abilities. So we'll start off first with the Dragonknight. So the Dragonknight has three primary or three skill trees. They have the Ardent Flame, Draconic Power, and Earthen Heart, and each of these three trees offer something as a tank, as a Dragonknight. Starting off first with Ardent Flame. So Ardent Flame is typically seen as a more DPS oriented skill tree. However, there are definitely skills here that are going to be very useful to you as a tank. So the ultimate isn't really going to be used too much. It's the Dragonknight standard. The only thing that it has going for it is really the reducing the damage taken from the standard of might by 15%, just because this does stack with things like major protection, minor maim, major maim, so that does stack with all of those buffs. So it's nice to have a little bit of additional mitigation there, but it's just very expensive, and in terms of group DPS, Warhorn is generally going to be a little bit better, but standard of might is kind of useful in situations where you don't really trust your healers and 4-man content. If you're a pug, you can do a little bit of damage while also reducing the damage that you take as well. But it's really going to be coming from the active abilities that really makes Dragonknight tanks pretty much what cements them in the meta, and that's going to be Engulfing Flames. So the text is kind of small here, but the Engulfing Flames is a morph of Fiery Breath, so Fiery Breath is unlocked when you get to rank 20 in the skill line. So Engulfing Flames, affected enemies take more damage from all flame damage attacks, and that's really what pushes Dragonknight tanks above all the other classes, because this is a unique debuff to the enemy. So it acts as a debuff on the enemy, and it increases the damage that they take from fire damage attacks by 10%. Now, if you are running pretty much like all stamina classes, then obviously this is not going to be very strong. The more stamina DPS you have, the weaker this debuff is going to be. But if you're doing stuff like Asylum or Cloud Rest, where you have pretty much all magic DPS, or if you have an even split of 4 magicka for stamina DPS, then this debuff does become quite powerful, because pretty much all magic DPS in the game right now are running 2 fire staves, so that's all of your light attacks, your fire blockade, any other sort of flame damage abilities, so things like Force Pulse, burning is affected by this, so this just increases the DPS overall by a not an insignificant margin. So Engulfing Flames is really why Dragonknight tanks are still considered king when it comes to tanking, when it comes to group utility. The next two abilities are also very useful as a tank. So the first one's going to be Fiery Grip. This is unlocked at when you reach rank 30. So this is what we call chains. It's more commonly known as chains in both in the PvE and PvP community. It can also be called a pull for those of you guys who play other MMOs, a pulling ability. So basically what it does is just it targets an enemy up to 22 meters away, and you basically pull them towards you. So this is obviously very, very powerful when it comes to having to group adds together when you need to basically do ad stacking. Now, you won't be able to pull everything. You'll only be able to pull mobs that are considered non-elite, so anything with a fancy health bar on the default UI, or any sort of elite mobs or bosses, they can't be pulled using Fiery Grip. But for all the other trash, you can pull them to you, and it's going to be very, very useful. It also has an added benefit of giving you Major Expedition, which increases your movement speed for 6 seconds. So that's pretty useful. You'll find if you guys watch my streams for Cloud Rest, you'll see that I do use chains to give myself that Major Expedition to kind of move around the field a little bit faster that way. Now, the one thing you do want to make sure here is that you want to take the Unrelenting Grip morph, because the Empowering Chains morph pulls you to the enemy instead, and that's not really what you want to have happen. You want to pull the enemy to you, so just make sure you take the Unrelenting Grip morph. Wardens do have another ability, an ability that matches this, but we'll talk about the differences between the Warden chains and the Dragonknight chains when we get to the Warden chains. The main downside, or rather difficulty of running Unrelenting Grip, is trying to target specifically the ad that you want to pull. That takes a little bit of practice to getting used to, but once you can get it down, it's actually pretty easy to chain a lot of ads really quickly, one after another. Now, Inferno is the last ability that you might find useful in the Ardent Flame ability, and that's mainly because of the morph Cauterize, which heals allies. As a tank, you really won't have that big of a heal, but every little bit of healing does help, and it can also target you, so that helps out a little bit there as well. All of these passives, they don't really impact you as a tank. And now if we go ahead and move on to Draconic Power, so under Draconic Power there are, again, pretty much every single ability in Draconic Power is very, very useful. So you have Spiked Armor, which is your Major Resolve, Major Ward. You have Dark Talons, which is a root. So basically it just keeps enemies in place. Again, much like Chains, you can't root boss enemies. You can't root elite mobs. It's only trash mobs. You have Dragon Blood, which is your burst heal. Green Dragon Blood is the morph that most tanks will take. Then your Reflective Scale, which is situationally useful. It helps reflects projectiles, so you take no damage from them at all. Plus, it also gives you immunity to snares and mobilizations, which can be very useful to have. And then Deep Breath is a AoE interrupt. Now, under the passive abilities, there is a passive under the DK line that the Wardens do not have, and that's Iron Skin. So Iron Skin increases the amount of damage you block by 10%. Wardens do not have any sort of passive that kind of increases the amount of damage you can block. So this is unique to the Dragonknights. So this does give you a little bit of additional damage mitigation while you're blocking. And on top of all this, all of these are pretty much unique specifically to Dragonknight. So you get the additional healing with Seed by 12%, which does stack with things like Minor Major Vitality. Well, you have a Draconic Power ability active, so that's usually going to be like Green Dragon Blood or Spiked Armor. You get additional health regen for each ability you have slotted, and you have spell resistance. So all of these are very nice passives to have as tanks that Wardens do not have. So Wardens don't have additional healing receive, they don't have additional health regen, they don't have additional damage reduction while blocking. So that kind of gives Dragonknights a little bit of an additional edge here when it comes to tanking. Wardens also don't have additional spell resistance, but it's actually not that big of a deal just because it's fairly easy to get up to the resistance cap or close to it in ESO. Now under Earthen Heart, this is another pretty useful line here. So Magma Armor, obviously, for the invulnerability, or I should say, doesn't make you invincible, but it makes you basically invincible by reducing all damage down to only 3% of your max health. So it would take 34 hits in order for you to die, assuming you're not getting any heals. Wardens do not have a similar ability, so if in those moments when you're kind of learning trials or you need a little bit of breathing space, Wardens don't really have anything that'll be able to protect you for that long. So Magma Shell is very, very strong, and while most endgame PvE tanks will not be using Magma Shell, it's still something to consider if you are learning how to tank. Now the big ability here is going to be Igneous Shield, Obsidian Shields. So this is the damage shield that Dragonknights have. Wardens, on the other hand, do not have any sort of damage shield. So the damage shield as a tank is pretty much, when you're comparing these two classes, is only specific to the Dragonknights. So again, this is just another advantage that Dragonknights have over Wardens, in that it is something that Dragonknights have that the Wardens do not. So in addition to Obsidian Shield, both of these have very good effects. So Igneous Shield just increases the shield strength. So it's I believe it's a third of your health, gives you a third of your health as your shield. And then Fragmented Shields increases the duration of Major Mending, which basically helps out your self-heals, so that's really nice to have as well. So both of these morphs are very, very nice to have. And now Wardens do have a source of Major Mending that you can proc, so this is not necessarily unique. Major Mending is not unique to the Dragonknights, but it's easier to proc Major Mending, arguably speaking, on a Dragonknight compared to a Warden. And now all of these passives are actually what really helps push Dragonknights ahead. So Battle Roar is the big one. So Battle Roar, when you cast an ultimate ability, you basically restore health, magic, and stamina for every point of the ultimate's cost. So when you use your Warhorn, when you use your Magma Armor, when you use Barrier, you basically are getting resources back right when you hit that ultimate. And if you're using Dragon Guard or Activate Dragon Guard, which reduces your ultimate cost, it'll still give you back the full cost of the ultimate, so 250. So this is really, really huge for sustain, especially for tanks that are just kind of learning things. It's very easy just to like slot a cheap ultimate and just have a really nice, easy source of sustain throughout the fight. So Battle Roar is huge. While it doesn't necessarily make or break you as a tank, it's still a very nice burst of resources when you need them the most. Wardens don't really have that same sort of resource sustain and burst effect that they have. Mountain's Blessing is another big passive here with Major Brutality. So Major Brutality is unique to the Dragonknight, so if you have a Stand DK or a Mag DK, you don't necessarily need to have a DK tank for Minor Brutality, but most groups will have Mountain's Blessing, Minor Brutality through a DK tank. So this is pretty big. It gives you 5% additional weapon damage, 10% in Murkmire. Plus it also generates ultimate for you, so it's an effective additional half ultimate every second. So basically it gets you pump out Warhorns a little bit faster here. Now Wardens do not lack in ultimate generation either, but this is in a unique passive to the Dragonknight tank. And then when you cast an Earthen Heart ability, you restore some stamina back. Wardens can restore stamina back as well and magicka back. They do have a passive that helps out there. So this is not necessarily unique, but it's more consistent than the Wardens, as we will see when we go over the Warden skill tree. So Wardens have three other, just like Dragonknights, they have three skill trees, starting off the Animal Companions line. So the big thing here is going to be Subterranean Assault and Deep Fissure for an AoE Major Fracture or Major Breach. You can no longer get both from either morph. So this is nice to have as a kind of AoE Major Fracture, Major Breach for trash pulls. And then obviously you have the Bullnetch, which is your main source of stamina regeneration. This is unique to the Wardens in that you're able to restore stamina while blocking. So blocking reduces your stamina regen down to 0. So the only way you can get stamina back is if you have like an Absorb Stamina glyph, you have the Earthen Heart passive, or you have the Bullnetch going on. So the Bullnetch is just basically, it'll just keep on restoring your stamina while you're blocking. And so that's a kind of an advantage that Wardens have over DKs, because DKs you will have to cast Igneous Shield in order to get your stamina back if you are blocking. Then under the passives here, there is a little bit of additional support here for Wardens. So I mentioned earlier that the additional ultimate gain is not unique to the Dragonknights, and that's true, because Savage Beast does give you ultimate on 8 seconds, so it's pretty much the exact same, 0.5 ultimate every second here. It does require you to cast a Animal Companion ability every 8 seconds, so you'd have to cast Bullnetch every 8 seconds. That's not a big deal because Bullnetch is a free cast, so it's pretty much just free ultimate for you. And now Flourish is another passive that is pretty useful, so it increases your magic and stamina regen by 12% when you have an Animal Companion ability slotted. So whenever you have Bullnetch, or if you decide to run the Feral Guardian for this passive, you have a little bit additional magic regen, so it's usually about 2% more compared to what a DK is able to get, because DKs have to use Magicka Aid under the support line, which only gives 10% max per ability slotted. Now the second one is going to be Green Balance. So this is actually more useful than you think for heal tanking. So when you have running 4-man content and you have a tank and 3 DPS, so this basically gives you a little bit of healing power as a tank. So Warden tanks are pretty useful in 4-man content if you're just running one tank. So obviously Secluded Grove, either morph is very, very nice. It's just a nice burst heal, very cheap ultimate. So you can combine this with something like War Machine, in order to give your group Major Slayer all the time. So this is it has some nice synergy with Wardens and War Machines. So you won't really be seeing that used too much in Vet Trials, but for 4-man content, this is definitely something that's pretty strong here. Now, in terms of the rest of these abilities, they're all usually a little bit too expensive for you to run as a tank. For example, Fungal Growth costs, the base cost is 4,600 Magicka, so that's pretty expensive. But there are a few abilities here that are pretty cheap, relatively cheap I should say, that have some pretty nice effects. So Wardens have a very easy way of applying Minor Lifesteal, that's through Leeching Vines. DKs can apply Minor Lifesteal as well, but they have to use Blood Altar, which has a cast time associated with this. Leeching Vines is pretty easy, you just hit the button, it just costs 2,700 Magicka, and you have Minor Lifesteal, so really nice to have here. And then you do have additional passive healing here through Green Lotus or Lotus Blossom, whichever one you want to pick. So it just gives you, restores health whenever you do light attacks, so if you're light attack weaving or you're doing heavy attacks, you're able to basically help restore health. And this is a fixed amount of health, so it doesn't matter what your Magicka is, your max Magicka, your spell damage is, it'll always restore this amount of health. So this is very nice to have as like a heal tank kind of situation here. Now I did mention that Major Mending is not unique to the DKs, so with accelerated growth, if you heal yourself or an ally under 40% health, you do get Major Mending, but it is much more difficult to proc on a Warden, so DKs usually have much higher uptimes on Major Mending compared to Wardens for this reason. So Wardens also have an additional sustain boost, whenever you heal an ally with the green bounce ability, you gain Magicka or Stamina 250, whichever resource pool is lower. So you're going to have to run a green bounce ability in order for this to work, so most tanks will run something like Leeching Vines or Green Lotus. And you will notice that it is less than what the DK can get back in terms of stamina, so it's 990 stamina for every Earthen Heart ability versus 250 stamina or Magicka, depending on which resource pool is lower as a tank. So something that you just want to take into consideration here. Now you do get some increased healing done, so while DKs get healing received, Wardens do get healing done, but again, there's only really 2, or you can argue 3 with the ultimate that are worth running, so you can still get more healing done to you as a DK compared to a Warden, so that kind of helps bump DKs a little bit above Wardens here. But Wardens do get Minor Toughness, so whenever you heal yourself or an ally, you gain Major Toughness. So that's basically a Warhorn, basically the health buff from Warhorn for 10 seconds. So this is something that's going to be unique to the Wardens in Murkmire, so that's really nice to have. And then Winter's Embrace is kind of your tanky line, so to speak. Now, Wardens do have a source of minor protection, so while DKs have a basically very selfish source of damage reduction, Wardens have a more selfless set ultimate in Sleet Storm, which gives major protection, so that is very nice to have, because the only other sources of major protection are, I believe it's only a Nightblade ultimate that guarantees major protection, so it's nice to have this, so that way if you do need to mitigate damage, if you do need that major protection buff, you don't have to have a Nightblade DPS run a non-DPS ultimate there. You have Ice Fortress, which gives you minor protection, so this is, while it's not necessarily unique to the Wardens, DKs can get it by running a Circle of Protection. It's a lot easier to get on a Warden, so it just gives you a little bit more additional damage mitigation there. Plus it also applies it to other people around you, so as a Warden tank you have a little bit of additional group utility because you're able to grant your allies Major Resolve, Major Ward, giving them a little bit more survivability. So Gripping Shards is basically the Warden version of Talons, so in that regard, in terms of CC capability, Wardens and DKs are pretty much equal, so that's not big of a deal. In terms of burst healing ability, your burst heal is going to be either Polar Wind or Arctic Blast, and it is definitely weaker than Green Dragon Blood. So Green Dragon Blood restores 33% of your missing health, while Polar Wind restores 15% of your max health instantly, and then 10% over 10 seconds, or 1% every 1 second. So this is a little bit weaker, and you do have to kind of keep in mind when you use it. So most DK tanks will use Green Dragon Blood when they're below 50%, and if it crit heals, it heals you all the way up to full. Polar Wind is going to be a little bit more challenging because the initial heal itself is usually going to end up being lower, even though it does restore 25% of your max health over 10 seconds. The final 10% is over 10 seconds though, so that's just something you want to keep in mind as a Warden tank. So the Green Dragon Blood is definitely considered the better burst heal for tanking. Now, Wardens do beat DKs in terms of ultimate generation because they do have a source of Major Heroism. It does require you to be up against somebody who uses projectiles, so like an archer or a mage, but Wardens can pretty easily get Major Heroism, so that's just a lot stronger ultimate game this way. And then Frozen Gate, which is the Warden version of Chains. So unlike Chains where you have to target an enemy, you can just kind of throw this onto the ground. It's a ground AoE and then it just pulls an enemy towards you. And it also applies Major Maim as well. So this is a very easy source of Major Maim. However, just like the DK Chains, you can't pull a boss, you can't pull elite mobs, you can only pull small mobs. And unlike Chains, you can't target a specific mob. So if you throw it onto a group of 3 mobs, it'll pull whichever mob is closest to you, rather than the one that might be furthest away from you, which might be the more dangerous mob. So there's no really selectivity there when it comes to using Frozen Gate. So that's kind of the downside of running a Warden tank. You don't have that selectivity that you do with Chains on a DK. Now, in terms of passive abilities, you do have an easier time applying Chilled, which is basically applies Minor Maim, which is not really that big of an advantage because you should be applying it already with Heroic Slash, so this is not really that useful. You do get some additional physical and spell resistance, 500 for each winner's ability slotted, so this is going to end up being lower than the spell resistance buff that that DKs get from the Draconic power passives, but you do get some additional physical resistance as well. You do get some snare reduction, so this is very nice for PvP if you want to go into PvP. And then Piercing Cold doesn't really affect you, that's more of a DPS passive there. So now that we've kind of gone over each of the skills and what each of the classes bring to the table, it's kind of now time which one is actually better. So going back to the Dragonknights, if you are going for the endgame PvEs, if you're going for score, if you're going for speed, if you're going for those achievements, Dragonknights are going to be superior, mainly just because of that Engulfing Flames. The additional DPS that you get from Engulfing Flames cannot be understated if you are pushing for those score guilds. So Mechanical Challenge, Hodor, Mundus, God, I'm blanking, whichever guild that Tabata runs with, I'm blanking on the name itself. But if you are in one of those types of guilds, if you're going for those high scores, you want a DK tank, at least one DK tank on your team for that Engulfing Flames debuff there. So if you are at that level, DKs are definitely going to be superior. That being said though, most of us are not playing at that level. I'm not playing at that level. Most of you guys probably aren't playing at that level. So while Engulfing Flames is a very nice buff, or I should say debuff on the enemy, for most of us it's not really going to make or break a score, because we're not going for score, we're not necessarily going for speed, we're not going for achievements or anything like that. And in that regard, that's where kind of the Warden comes into play a little bit more. Now, I will say that DKs are easier to learn. That's from a subjective level. It's easier to learn how to tank on a DK just because, mainly because of the Draconic power passives here. These passives here are huge when you're just starting to learn how to tank. The additional damage reduction, the additional healing that you get, the additional spell resistance, that's very, very nice to have as you're starting to learn. Now, obviously, as you start to get more experience, you start seeing less return out of it because you're getting more experience, you're learning the mechanics, you're running with better groups, perhaps. So these passives usually end up being a wash, or not that big of an advantage over the Warden passives. But if you're just starting to learn how to tank, the entire Draconic power passive line is very, very nice to have. It doesn't. I won't want to say it is like a crutch, but it definitely helps you how to learn how to tank a little bit easier that way. But overall, in my opinion, the DK is generally going to be better for most people when it comes to tanking. That's not to say Wardens don't make great tanks. I used to play Warden tank. It's just that Wardens do have a little bit of a steeper learning curve just because of the lack of battle roar from the Earthen Heartline, so you're not getting that burst of resources back every time you use a Warhorn. Generally speaking, even though you do have the Bull Nudge and you do get some passes back from the green, I forget what it's called, from the Nature's Gift passive, it's not really comparable to the DK's Battle Roar or the DK's Helping Hands, at the very least at the beginner level. Once you get up to the level where you kind of know where you can heavy attack weave and things like that, Warden tanks, their sustain pretty much comes neck to neck with DKs. There's pretty much no difference at all, especially when you consider things like Deep Thoughts and Balance kind of helping you out there. So in terms of sustain, DKs generally have a little bit easier time, but Wardens don't necessarily lack in that department either. The other big thing with Warden tanks that I really like is the additional minor lifesteal. It's just so much easier to get minor lifesteal as a Warden tank compared to a DK tank. Now that being said, you could have your healers run Blood Altar instead of the tank, so you get minor lifesteal that way. That's just something you want to take into consideration as well when you're trying to decide between Warden and DKs. The big thing that kind of annoys me the most with Warden tanks is the fact that the burst heal is not as strong. It's only 15% of your max health, and their version of chains is just a lot clunkier to use. It requires a lot more advanced thinking. While it does apply Major Maim, it's not very selective. It's not a selective target. I personally don't like the fact that the burst heal is just not as strong. It makes me feel like I'm relying a little bit more on my healer, which is not really my playstyle as a tank. I prefer to make sure I don't have to depend on my healer as much. That being said though, Warden tanks are definitely a lot of fun to play. It definitely is a change of pace, and they do have a lot of group buffs. So in terms of group utility, I think Wardens beat out DKs. But like I said earlier, for most of us, DKs are going to be stronger, mainly because of that Battle Roar passive as well as the Draconic power passives. The main thing is though, your best, whatever class is going to be best is whatever class is best for you. So I started off playing as a DK tank, so I understand the DK tank very well, but that doesn't mean that you can't clear the same content, that same level of content with any other class. I just think that the DK tank is easier to learn, it's easier to master, and that's kind of more important when it comes to the support role. Being able to master the fight, being able to master your class and your role very quickly as a support role, because really it's support roles that make or break a group. So being able to master that a lot faster is obviously going to put my vote towards the DK tank when it comes to which one is better between the DK and the Warden. So that's it for this video. I would like to hear your guys' thoughts as to which tank you guys think is better, the DK tank or the Warden tank. Like I said, both of them have their merits, both of them have their drawbacks, and they both bring something to the table. It could be that instead of running 2 DK tanks, you might have 1 DK, 1 Warden tank, and you get the best of both worlds. So I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts, so please leave them down in the comment section below. It's nice to have a little bit of a discussion as well, to kind of see how other tanks kind of view the advantages and disadvantages between the various classes in the game. So hopefully you guys found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.